If you've ever caught yourself explaining something simple 3 different ways just to make sure the other person understands, or if you've walked away from a conversation replaying everything you said and wishing you'd said less, this video is for you. Over-explaining isn't something you choose to do. It's not about being insecure or not trusting yourself. It's a pattern your mind has learned, a way of protecting yourself that made sense at some point. And if this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Over-explaining is not a personality flaw. It's not a sign that you lack confidence or that you don't know how to communicate. It's a psychological response, a strategy your brain developed to manage uncertainty, judgment, or the fear of being misunderstood. And like all responses, it has a reason behind it. People who over-explain tend to share certain patterns. These aren't labels, they're observations, things that show up again and again. The first is repeating the same point in different ways. You say something once, then you say it again with slightly different words, then you add context, then you clarify the context. You're not trying to be redundant, you're trying to make sure there's no room for misinterpretation. Your brain is scanning for gaps, for places where the other person might misunderstand, and each time you sense a possible gap, you fill it. But the filling never feels complete. There's always one more detail, one more angle, one more way to say it that might make it clearer, so you keep going. Not because you don't know when to stop, but because stopping feels risky. The second is anticipating criticism before it comes. You don't just explain what happened, you explain why it happened, why it wasn't your fault, why anyone in your position would have done the same thing. You're defending yourself against an accusation that hasn't been made yet. This happens because your brain has learned to expect judgment. Maybe in the past, not explaining yourself fully led to consequences, misunderstanding, blame, disappointment. So now, even in neutral situations, your mind prepares for attack. It builds the defense before the question is even asked. You're not being paranoid, you're being careful. But that carefulness shows up as over-explaining. The third is providing unnecessary context. Someone asks you a simple question, where were you? What did you do today? Did you finish that thing? And instead of a short answer, you give them the whole story. You explain what led up to it, what you were thinking, what else was happening at the time. You're not trying to waste their time. You're trying to paint the full picture so they understand completely. Because in your mind, a short answer might sound cold, dismissive, suspicious. So you add layers. You make sure they see the reasoning, the effort, the intention. But what feels like clarity to you often feels like too much information to them. The fourth is difficulty ending an explanation. Even after you've made your point, you keep talking. You add one more sentence, one more example, one more clarification. You can feel yourself doing it. You can hear the conversation shifting, but you can't seem to stop. This happens because your nervous system hasn't received the signal that it's safe to stop. You're waiting for confirmation, a nod, a verbal acknowledgement. Something that tells you the other person fully understands and accepts what you said, but that confirmation doesn't always come clearly, so you keep explaining, hoping that the next sentence will be the one that lands, the one that makes them see exactly what you mean. The fifth is over-apologizing while explaining. You don't just explain, you apologize for needing to explain. Sorry, I know I'm talking a lot. Sorry, I just want to make sure you understand. Sorry, let me clarify. The apologies aren't really about taking up time. They're about managing the other person's perception of you. You're trying to signal that you're aware, that you're not trying to dominate the conversation, that you know You might be too much, but the apologies themselves become part of the over-explaining. Another layer, another thing you feel the need to justify. The sixth is needing reassurance that you were understood. After you explain something, you check. Does that make sense? Do you see what I mean? You get it, right? You're not asking because you think the other person is slow. You're asking because you need confirmation that your words landed the way you intended. That there's no confusion, no lingering question, no misinterpretation waiting to surface later. This need for reassurance comes from a place of hypervigilance. Your brain is constantly monitoring for signs of disconnect. And until you receive clear feedback, it assumes the disconnect is there. So why does over-explaining happen? It's not random. The brain learns patterns based on past experience. If you grew up in an environment where being misunderstood had consequences, your nervous system adapted. Maybe your words were twisted. Maybe your intentions were questioned. Maybe you were blamed for things that weren't your fault. Or maybe the people around you required extensive explanation before they would listen, before they would believe you, before they would stop being upset. Over time, your brain learned that clarity requires repetition, that being heard requires volume. Not loud volume, verbal volume, more words, more detail, more defense. And even when the environment changes, the pattern stays. Over-explaining often develops in relationships where approval felt conditional, where you had to earn understanding instead of receiving it freely, where silence was interpreted as guilt, where short answers were treated as evasiveness. In those environments, explaining yourself wasn't optional. It was survival. It was how you maintained safety, how you avoided conflict, how you proved you weren't hiding anything. And your nervous system remembers. It still prepares for those dynamics, even when they're no longer present. This doesn't mean over-explaining serves you now, but it does mean it made sense at one point. Your brain wasn't malfunctioning, it was adapting. People who over-explain often feel exhausted after social interactions, not because the interaction itself was difficult, but because the internal process was. You spent the entire conversation monitoring yourself, watching for reactions, adjusting your explanations in real time, rewinding and reviewing what you said. By the time the conversation ends, you're drained. And then comes the replay. You go over everything you said, you notice where you rambled, where you repeated yourself, where you probably said too much, and you feel regret. Not because you said anything wrong, but because you wish you could have just been simple, direct, brief. You wish you didn't feel the need to explain so much. Over-explaining also creates distance in relationships. Not because people don't care about you, but because the constant clarification can feel like you don't trust them to understand, or that you're defending yourself against an accusation they never made. They might pull back, not out of judgment, but out of confusion. They don't know why you're working so hard to be understood when they were already listening, and you don't know how to explain that the explaining isn't really about them. It's about a pattern you can't seem to turn off. Understanding why you over-explain doesn't make it stop immediately, but it does shift how you see it. You start to notice the moment it's happening, the moment your brain starts adding unnecessary layers. And in that noticing, there's a small opening, not to fix yourself, but to pause, to ask quietly whether this explanation is for them or for you, whether it's about clarity or about safety. You don't have to have the answer. Just asking the question is enough to create a little space between the impulse and the action. You're allowed to let your first answer be enough. You're allowed to trust that if someone doesn't understand, they'll ask. You're allowed to stop defending yourself against questions that haven't been asked. This isn't about changing who you are. It's about recognizing that the protection you built doesn't always match the situation you're in now. If this resonated with you, there are other videos on this channel that explore behaviors that don't make sense until you understand the psychological systems behind them. Sometimes one pattern helps you recognize another. Thank you for watching.